Incremental contracts are quite an elegant type of contract. Let me try and illustrate incremental contracts by perhaps choosing some very simple parameters. So let's say, for example, that we have a year-long contract. It doesn't have to be a year-long contract, but for the sake of argument, let's say that it is. Let's break that year-long contract up into milestones. So let's say, for example, that we wish to break it up into quarterly milestones. You don't have to, but just for the sake of example, let's say that we do that. So let's break this year-long contract up into quarterly milestones. Let's also assume that we're going to do 2-week sprints. And so what we would do is we'd go away and we'd do 2-week sprints on an ongoing basis. So we start off by doing 2-week sprints. These figures are supposed to represent a sprint, by the way. So let's say that we go away for a sprint. We do everything that Scrum talks about. At the end of every single sprint, we're going to have an increment of potentially shippable product. And what you do is you do that on an ongoing basis. For a milestone, so for 1 quarter, 3 months, there are going to be roughly about 6 sprints. So you go away for 6 sprints. Every single sprint, you'll have an increment of potential shippable product. Once you get to that very first milestone, what you do is you package everything that you currently have and you do a drop. So you package everything up, invite your customer in, and they can inspect the product that you've just delivered. They can inspect that package, and they may at that point decide that they want to take that package and ship it into a production environment. You would then go away again for another 6 sprints. So you go away for another 6 sprints. Every single sprint, you have an increment of potentially shippable product. Once you get to that second milestone, again, you do the same thing. You package everything up. You invite your customer in. You're going to have much more, of course. Your customer come in, they can inspect the product. If they like that product, they may then decide that they want to ship that product into a production environment. And then you may decide to continue to the third milestone. Again, exactly the same dynamic. So again, you go away for another 6 sprints. Every single sprint should have an increment of potentially shippable product. Once you get to the end of that 6th sprint, you would package everything up. You'd invite the customer in, they can come in, they can inspect the product. If they like the product, again, there's a real possibility that they can take that product and ship that product into a production environment. At that point, your customer may then decide to terminate the contract. So at each milestone, the client has one of 2 options. The very first option is to continue on to the next milestone. And that's what we've seen so far. So the very first option that they have is to continue on. The other option that they may choose is to terminate the contract. And if they do that, if they terminate the contract before the completion of the contract, then usually they pay some penalty. And often the penalty that they pay is some percentage of the remaining funds, usually in the order of, say, 10 to 15% of the remaining funds is the penalty that they pay for terminating the contract sooner at each one of the different milestones. So that's really an incremental contract. There are a couple of things about incremental contracts that are really, really nice that are probably worth pointing out. So the very first thing that's probably worth pointing out is that the cost is actually fixed per milestone. So the cost per milestone is fixed. And really it equates to the cost of funding the team for that milestone. I'll show you the costing model very shortly. So as soon as I finish this overview, I'll then very quickly show you the costing model. And it's actually very, very straightforward. So it's a fixed cost per milestone. So you can limit your amount of customers exposure to the milestone. And not only that, if 3 months worth of funding for a team is too much, then you can break it down. Rather than use 3 monthly milestones, you can have a milestone at the end of every single month. And so you can tailor this model to suit your customer's risk profile. So that's one thing that's really, really nice about this contract. The other thing that's probably worthwhile pointing out is that there is a real possibility that your customer can release after the very first milestone. That is a realistic possibility. And the reason why that's a realistic possibility in Scrum is because your teams are always producing an increment of potentially shippable product. And so you should find by the time you get to that 6th milestone, there is a realistic possibility that you can ship into a production environment. Not only that, you're going to deliver your client's highest priority items by that very first milestone. And the reason for that is because what will be happening is that you'll have a team working from a product backlog, a prioritized product backlog. And so if you have a product owner that's really, really smart, what they'll do is they'll take the highest priority items, the most important things to the business, and they'll put that at the top of the product backlog. And that will appear as part of that very first package that you deliver after the very first milestone. So this particular model is a model that is fixed dollar amount. And I'll show you that calculation very, very shortly. Fixed timeline driven by the milestones. Fixed quality because you're using Scrum with the definition of done, but variable scope. So this is a variable scope contract. And the reason why it's a variable scope contract is because we don't know how much is going to be delivered as part of each of these different milestones. We really don't know that. You don't know that because you don't know how deep your team is going to get into your product backlog at the end of every single milestone. Your team may get a little way into the product backlog. They may get a significant way into the product backlog. They may get a substantial way into the product backlog, but you have no real way of knowing that. And so this style of contract is fixed dollar amount per milestone. So fixed dollar, fixed timeline driven by these milestones, fixed quality through the use of Scrum, and in particular through the definition of done and variable scope. Before we continue, I'd like to say a few words about my company, Agile Federation. We offer Scrum and Agile consulting, training, and certification. Our homepage is agilefederation.com. If you visit us on our homepage, you'll always find something interesting to download, a free presentation or ebook perhaps. In the Events tab, you will see our currently scheduled Scrum training events. We offer Certified Scrum Master training and Certified Scrum Product Owner training. In the Resources tab, you'll find pages on a number of different Scrum topics, including this one. And if you'd like to talk to me about anything discussed in this video or anything related to Scrum, you can always contact me through the Contacts tab. I look forward to working with you. Let me now show you the costing model for incremental contracts. The costing model is actually very, very straightforward, especially if you have done the traditional approach to costing out fixed price contracts. Typically, if you're costing out a fixed price contract, usually what you do is you end up with a very, very complex spreadsheet. You'd have rows for each of the different roles that people will play throughout the duration of the product or project. You have columns for all the different phases. You have to estimate how much of each role is present as part of each of the different phases. You have the cost for each of the different roles. And if you try and do the calculation, you'll find that it's a very complex matrix, usually maybe about 15, 20 columns long, maybe 150 to 200 rows deep. So it can be quite complex. The costing model for Scrum teams is actually very, very trivial with a incremental contract. They are very, very straightforward. So let me actually walk you through that costing model to show you how it's frequently done. So the costing model. The simplicity of the Scrum costing model, the incremental costing model, is driven by an assumption. And that assumption is that you have a dedicated team. Once you've made that assumption, the costing model becomes very, very straightforward and very, very trivial. This is a fair assumption in Scrum. So having a dedicated team is a fair thing in Scrum. Let me walk you through it. Let's say that we have a team. Let's say that we have a team of, I don't know, maybe 7. So a team of 7. And let's say that they have a daily rate. So let's assume that we're going to have a blended daily rate of perhaps, I don't know, $2,000 per day per person. So this may not be realistic where you're at, but just for the sake of argument, let's say it's $2,000 per person per day. So for a team of 7, that gives us a daily rate of what? That's 14K per day. Let's also add in one Scrum Master plus one Scrum Master. Let's say that they're at 2K per day. So for a team of 7 plus one Scrum Master, so for a team plus Scrum Master, that's going to give us a daily rate of 16K per day. Let's make a second assumption. So our very first assumption is that we have a dedicated team. Our second assumption is that we're going to have a 2-week sprint. If we're going to have a 2-week sprint, then for a 2-week sprint, there are 10 working days within that 2-week period of time. So for a team plus a Scrum Master, they're going to be at 160K per sprint. So the cost per sprint is fixed. Of course, it's never going to be quite that simple because you'll have all sorts of variables. You're going to have licensing costs. You're going to have hardware, perhaps. You might have team members taking vacation or getting sick. So it's always going to be a little bit of complexity, but you're going to have that complexity in the real world anyway. So you naturally have to take those into consideration. The base cost for the Scrum team is a very, very simple calculation, driven in large part by a couple of key assumptions that you do need to make. One of them is that you have a dedicated team, and the second is that you're working with a 2-week sprint. But once you've done that, all the math is very, very straightforward. I hope you enjoyed that. My name's Kane, and I'm from Agile Federation. Thank you very much.